Joining us today are retired U.S. Army Colonel John Sweet and foreign affairs and security policy expert Mark Toth. Welcome to our studio.
Hey, Sophia, thanks for having us back on the show.
Sophia, thank you. Great to be here.
Russia's oil prices has just plunged to its lowest level in 2.5 years. Bloomberg says the drop follows fresh U.S. warning that countries continuing to buy and to have business with Russia could face additional sanctions. How significant is this hit to Russia's economy? Mark, what's your take on that?
Yeah, Sophia, it's significant. I mean, what we've seen here, and try to explain it for viewers, the normal Brent crude oil price is kind of the benchmark in the world for what oil trades are trading at. And right now, when I checked just before coming on air, that was at $64 a barrel. At this point, the latest data that we have on the Russian market for their Euro crude benchmark is that it's fallen to $36.60 a barrel. That's significant. That means that it's trading at a discount of roughly $28.60 compared to what the rest of the world is getting. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. The Brent crude is a better type of oil. It's medium, so it doesn't require as much refinement and processing, and so you get a higher yield out of it, whereas the Russian oil is heavier and it requires more of that. But it's a huge blow to them. I mean, that type of decline in price, because just roughly a month ago, especially before the attacks from Ukraine started to take full effect, that difference or that discount, if you will, was only about $12. So that's doubled just in the course of a month. Now, part of that is because of these looming sanctions. The drop dead date, if you will, is November 21st, which is the date that the U.S. sanctions take full effect that can't be in your system. And we have seen both the Chinese and the Indians pulling back for purchasing from them. Now, also, Zelensky's favorite form of sanctions, missile strikes into that Novosibirsk port facility on the Black Sea, has had a big impact as well, taking out as many as 700,000 barrels, if you will, of oil a day. And that's just coming back online. But that's been significant. But up until now, basically Russia throughout, and I'm just talking about gas exports, oil exports now, crude oil, they've been able to ship about 35 ships a week. And they lost 5 of those or so when that port was down on the Black Sea. So you can see where that difference, which averages roughly 14 to 17% at any given time, of how that strike diminished their oil revenues and ability to export. So between the sanctions, between Zelensky's kinetic sanctions, if you will, it's been significant. And obviously Putin's been funding his war this way. So they're under immense pressure. He'll probably have to discount oil even more. So this probably gets worse for him, not better, but time will tell.
And meanwhile, the Moscow Times reports that Russia's economic growth was essentially flat in the third quarter, with the state statistic agency saying the war costs and Western sanctions are starting to bite. Mark, from your perspective, is it a sign that an economic collapse is approaching in Russia, or it's still too early to make that call?
Well, I think what we can say, Sophia, is that there's definitely reaching a point where it's likely what you call stagnation, which is that they just can't achieve growth no matter how they go about doing it. There's just not the capacity to do it, even though there's potentially funds coming from the state level, inflated as they are, or likewise. The problem that you're running into here when you're dealing with a dictatorship like Putin has, you have a lot of tools at your disposal. So I'm leery of saying that the economy is just going to implode overnight. I think that's taking a Western standard and trying to apply it to a dictatorship, which is never wise. And then obviously Putin's not acting alone. He does have India. He does have China. There are potential avenues for them through indirect means to continue to support his economy. So look, all of this is good. It's like a heavyweight fight in the 10th round. Everyone's exchanging blows, and the more that Ukraine can continue to hurt Russia's economy, that's a good thing. I just don't want to give the false impression to viewers that some kind of knockout blow is nearing. It could come, right? It could be a left hook out of nowhere that it topples quickly. But I think Putin still has options, and we're not seeing, at least in terms of any kind of negotiating posture on his part, where he feels his economy is about to implode. So I think it is what it is right now, and it's good. Ukraine needs to keep doing more of the same. And these sanctions need to take effect. And I think they could even have a broader effect if the U.S. Senate were to eventually pass these secondary sanctions and Trump to implement them, because then it would make these sanctions be all the wider and deeper. But we're not there yet.
Given the amount in sanctions and the sharp drop in Russia's energy revenues, John, do you think this could have a tangible impact on the situation on the battlefield? And from your perspective, could this economic pressure translate into real changes on the front line?
So I think the short answer is, in the immediate term, no. Look, these are all the impacts that Mark is making, I had discussed, are all impacts that are happening within months, 3 to 6 months, maybe a year, that will impact Russia's ability to continue to finance the war and to continue to sustain operations in Ukraine. But for now, we're still seeing upwards to 1,000 Russians today that are getting killed, which means that they are still pushing forces on the ground, but they're also still attacking clearly with drones and ballistic missiles. So in the now, the impact is minimal. In the long term or the immediate, within like the next 3 to 6 months, it may have an effect. But Ukraine has to fight two battles. They have to fight that deep fight, which they're doing very effectively. But at the same time, they can't ignore the close fight. And the close fight right now is costing them terrain and costing them towns and villages.
Actually, I want also to turn to the situation on the ground, and we know that heavy losses and heavy fighting season going around Pokrovsk. And according to Estonia's Defense Forces intelligence chief, he has warned that of a potential Russian breakthrough in not in Donetsk region, but in the Zaporizhia region. John, what's your assessment on the battlefield picture right now?
So my assessment is this. If what President Zelensky said is accurate, upwards to 110,000 Russian soldiers in the Donbass region, what they're doing right now is they're probing all of the lines, 600 kilometers worth of defensive lines, looking for that one weak spot or those 2 or 3 weak spots. So what you're seeing is that most recent tactic that we discussed most recently in the Hill in Pokrovsk, what you're seeing is the infiltration of small units getting into the rear of Ukrainian lines. And then you see them consolidating behind the lines and disrupting lines of communications. What we're seeing is that those dismounted soldiers are the ones that are getting in, causing the disruptions, but they're also looking for those areas of vulnerability, those areas of weakness, those areas that other troops can exploit. So Ukraine now is being forced to defend everything. And when you defend everything, you basically defend nothing. Okay, so the forces that are on the ground are doing exceptional work, and they're doing a lot of damage, with 1,000 casualties a day that they're inflicting upon the Russians. But if the Russians can continue to add 1,000 people to the battlefield every day, it's a zero-sum game. So they have to be looking for those exploitation forces. Where are those forces staged? Where are they set? Okay, where do the Russians think they're going to find a weakness to exploit? And they have to attack that. We call that interdiction. They have to go after the larger forces. They still have to pay attention to the interdicting forces, don't get me wrong. But they have to be looking for the forces that are going to exploit those gaps. And right now we're seeing, yes, what's described in many reports as breakthroughs in certain areas aren't necessarily breakthroughs, but they are gaps that the Russians have identified as for exploitation for a later date. And when that is to be determined how quickly they can get those forces there. Now, the other part that Russia is vulnerable to is moving. Anytime they move an exploitation force, Ukraine's been very effective with their drones in identifying and destroying them. So it's a cat and mouse game right now, and we're still at a zero-sum game.
And from past year, we heard about capture of Pokrovsk almost every day. Do you think it will be the same tactic for Zaporizhia region?
They'll try to do the same thing. Again, the tactic that the Russians like to use is they like to envelop towns. So what I mean by envelop, they identify the target, and then they try to surround that target from the right to the left, and then encircle it, and then, in a sense, trap the occupying forces inside. So that's the tactic that they've been using since day one, is the envelopment or double envelopment. And I anticipate that that's what they're doing in that region too. Again, it's identifying where those exploitation forces are and defeating them before they arrive on the battlefield. And that's difficult. Don't get me wrong. The intelligence folks, the guys that are looking for the enemy forces, have got to identify them so that the larger assets, the artillery, the tomahawks, if they ever have tomahawks, or the storm shadows, can be effective against those forces when they mass in order to exploit what they perceive to be defensive weaknesses.
In recent days, EU leaders have been talking about the war possibly ending in the next few years, and we heard different numbers. The European Commission chief mentions 2026, while French President Emmanuel Macron actually points to 2027. Mark, what do you make of these timelines, and do they actually align with the reality on the ground?
Yes, Sophia, I think it's a great question because, look, political leaders may want to wage war in terms of concrete dates, be it 2026, 2027. The reality is on the ground is that we're at a stalemate. So it's difficult to determine exactly just how much of this can be moved in that 1 to 2 year time frame unless there are corresponding military measures coming from the West. And we just don't see those yet. John and I have often called for game changers. For instance, an air defense system it's more proactive to what Ukraine's needs are, not just in its cities to protect its civilians, but also in terms of protecting its forward forces along the front lines. That hasn't happened yet. We've talked about having a sky shield, if you will, that protects at least Western Ukraine from these, devastating ballistic missile and drone attacks. That hasn't happened yet. We haven't even seen a willingness on the part of NATO, especially countries like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, that have had air and drone incursions into their own airspace. They're not even willing to shoot down these drones in Ukrainian airspace or Belarusian airspace if they're coming from that way before they even reach NATO's borders. So I think it's awfully optimistic of them to be talking about when this war might end. Maybe they're hopeful that there's an economic end date to this. But I think, as I mentioned earlier on the segment, I think that's a bit of fool's gold because, look, Putin is not in this alone. China has its own stakes in this and may, in different ways, indirectly support him above and beyond just oil purchases, which they may delay for a while because of the impending sanctions that have that wind down date or drop dead date, if you will, on November 21st. So I'm leery of it. I think it's optimistic thinking on their part. I know that John probably has some commentary here from a military standpoint, but to me, it's just a bit of fool's gold to be putting a timestamp on this at this point.
Yes, Sophia, let me just add on to what Mark said. I think that's wishful thinking, okay? You have to set conditions in order to achieve outcomes, okay? And just saying 2026 or 2027 because it fits your timeline, France, France, Germany, Poland, whatever other countries are involved, that doesn't make it so. It's only so if there's decisive victories on the battlefield. And unless NATO and the United States contributes to those decisive victories, it's not going to occur. So again, that's wishful thinking. And you have to actually do something in order to get something. And right now, doing something, I give the French credit. The French are sold 100 Rafale jet fighters to Ukraine. That's a good thing. But those jet fighters won't be introduced until 2026, 2027 at the earliest. The question is, what are you doing now? Okay, and right now we're missing the now part. Everyone's focused on the future part, thinking that this is going to come to a conclusion when economic sanctions take hold. But the economic sanctions is just one instrument of national power, and alone by itself isn't not going to be successful.
And indeed, in this light, we also know about possible decision, which is not yet taken by the European Council, about using this Russian frozen assets in order to give Ukraine a reparation loan. Do you see the willingness of the EU basically to continue the support? Because Ukrainian governments warned that for the next year, Ukraine probably will not have enough finance to fight. Mark, what's your take on that?
Yeah, we've really clearly we've reached an inflection point here in terms of the funding of the war, and it all stems to these how these frozen funds are going to be used. They thought they had a pathway forward that they were going to unfreeze them, that they'd be used to fund the war going forward. Belgium balked. Basically, they said, "Look, we're worried about getting sued after the war." Again, people thinking past the initial problem, the current problem, if you will. But Belgium said it. So the backup plan was, okay, well, what if we do guarantees, but that means taking on more debt? Or what if we just take on more debt in general across the EU? And that's run into obstacles. So there are three different ways. And Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission, is basically saying, look, we've got to decide because not giving Ukraine what it needs to be able to continue to fight this war economically is not acceptable. So I think they'll get there. But at this point, the EU, I think, is wrapping itself into a bind. And part of it is because of different kind of politics. You've got Slovakia. It doesn't want to take on more debt. It doesn't want to see this war continue. Is looking like Orban and Hungary to try to find ways to end it. So they're creating problems. So I suspect what will happen at the end of the day is that you'll probably see some kind of compromise. We don't know yet. Sophia, obviously you yourself have reported extensively from Brussels. But my guess is we'll see some kind of form where these assets get unfrozen. And then certain countries, a coalition of the willing, if you will provide Belgium some type of guarantees that in the future, if there's some kind of suit, that they'll stand by them. But, in my mind, that's the best, easiest way forward because getting all of the EU to accept more debt may be more problematic in the short term. Time will tell.
Poland's Chief of General Staff Wiesław Kukula called Sunday's sabotage on the Polish rail line to Ukraine a pre-war state, emphasizing that the adversary has begun preparing for the war. We are seeing this hybrid warfare from Russia continue actively. We are not only talking about drone attacks and unidentified drones over Western Europe. What does this signal? John, do you think Russia now is showing that it has no plans to stop?
Well, what Russia's signaling is that is their continued aggressiveness, okay? And what this is a message. There's a message being sent to Poland of what we can do. Okay, we've seen the sabotage operations that have gone throughout Western Europe. We've seen the intrusions of drones. We've seen the intrusions of jet fighters. We've seen the intrusions of helicopters. We've seen them force migration into NATO, and now we're seeing sabotage of rail lines. Okay, so it's messaging. It's telling Poland, to back off, and Poland's not. Okay, Poland's not going to back off. And the one person who is most afraid of Poland is the president of Belarus, which is Lukashenko. He's scared to death of Poland. He turns to Russia for help. He's afraid, I believe, that because of his early actions with Russia, affording them his terrain to fire missiles from it, to launch an invasion into Ukraine, that somehow that's going to boomerang back on him when and if Russia were to fail in Ukraine, that the next failure would be Belarus. So no, they're actively sending a message to Poland to back off, and Poland's not doing it.
Mark, French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday has announced that the multinational coalition working on security guarantees for Ukraine plans to move to a new phase of force deployment by Christmas. Are we essentially back to talking about NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, and how realistic this scenario, taking into the account these possible peace talks and etc.?
At this point, my best understanding of what Macron is probably trying to do here is get Putin to come to the negotiating table. And by talking about having troop levels, et cetera, that would be part of a deployment force and figuring that out by December. It's probably some pressure on that, maybe his version of tomahawks, if you will, that Trump did to try to entice Putin to the table. Personally, I think, and again, I apologize for any anger that may show through here, is that I think a lot of this is wishful thinking. Everyone keeps talking about how to end the war, what the war is going to look like, how security guarantees are going to happen after the war. But we keep ignoring the fact that Putin is not ready to end this war, but he continues to do these military movements around Kupiansk in the north and around Pokrovsk in the south, threatening Zaporizhia and so forth. We're just not seeing any kind of decline in that. So in my mind, I think it gets back to the wording and praising that John used earlier. It's just kind of wishful thinking on Macron's part. Look, it's all good. I think it should be a line in the sand just get it done. Say that it's going to be clear that in any post-war environment now, Putin, you've gone so far that there are going to be NATO forces. They may not wear the NATO flag on their shoulders, but they are going to wear the flags of NATO member states on their shoulders. And that's a non-negotiating point at this point, that you bought that's what you own for having invaded and perpetrated this war as long as you have. It's time to stop talking about it. I mean, we've said this a couple of segments ago or episodes ago on this program, that the time for Europe to start, to keep talking is done. Start doing. It's all great to be saying these things, but that's just a politician mouthing off. Let's see some substantive action come out of this. I'm just tired of hearing about all these promises about what this is going to look like. Get it done. Because this is just frustrating. It's not leading to anything positive. And meanwhile, Ukraine continues the slog of a fight. And we're seeing that it's not going anywhere fast enough in terms of creating relief for Ukrainian civilians that are almost under daily attack from Russia. So Macron can say all these things, they're good, but we've heard him mouth off before. He's talked about nuclear shields in the past for Ukraine and for the rest of his European colleagues, or fellow member states, Germany in particular. But at the end of the day, he never really puts up. It's time that he puts out.
Thank you for both for being with us today, and thank you for your insights and this interesting discussion.
Thank you,
Nice to see you. Thanks for having us back on.